I'd like to introduce Professor Jeannie Paterson, who is joining us from the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics at the University of Melbourne. And Professor Paterson's research covers, lots of issues that came up in the last session yesterday around consumer protection, credit, around liability and data protection law, but also the focus on the ethics components of law and regulation when it comes to new digital technologies. And these have been very active discussions in both countries. So I'm very grateful, Professor, that you're able to give us some of your time today to share some insights on what's going on at the centre, the work you're doing, and what's happening in Australia.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm actually gonna put up some slides, if that's okay. And I'll explain why once I've got those up. So just okay, so you should be able to see that now, yeah? Ooh, sorry, just move it. Excuse me while I readjust my screen so I can actually drive these. Okay, now you should be able to see those slides, yeah?
Yes, we can.
Great. Now I just need to put them on the right Zoom. Give me one sec. So I'm just fiddling with the laptop. There we go. Okay, that's better. Okay, so what I thought I would talk a bit about today as a way of illustrating our work is I'm going to talk about generative AI, and I'm going to talk about the sort of way in which ideas of technology, ethics and law coincide when we're thinking about these new novel technologies. And that really epitomizes what the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics does, because we're a cross-disciplinary research centre based at the University of Melbourne. And what we try to do, our mission, if you like, is to demystify AI, and through doing that, bring together conversations about ethics and responsibility in relation to the opportunities presented by these new technologies. So I'm going to talk really about those three issues in relation to generative AI, and hopefully explain why I think you need all three perspectives when we're thinking about AI, and we shouldn't just rush either to technological solutions or to legal solutions, because in fact that sort of ethical, moral or normative component is really important as well. And in fact, we need all three perspectives. And if people have questions, you can ask questions on the way. You'll probably need to put up your hand so I won't see you, or we can have questions at the end. So I'll talk for, I guess, about 25 minutes, and then we can have a bit more of a chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to refresh our minds about what I'm talking about by having a bit of an explainer. I'm then going to talk about how generative AI, at least where I'm working, is seen to be useful and helpful for people's work in the academy or the law field or any of, I guess, the professions. I'm going to talk about social concerns about generative AI. I'm going to talk about regulation. Then I'm going to come to that really, what I think is the really important point, which is the human choices that we're making about how we use AI. Because at the end of the day, the choices we make as a civil society are the things that will drive both the technology and the law, if we choose to make that happen. So just first of all, my explainer, I think it's always useful to remember that there's been a long progression of technology in social interactions, in society, and the use of sort of automated systems to either assist with decision making by humans or in fact to make decisions for humans has a bit of a long history. So expert systems, which are simple hand-coded systems with sort of yes, no, or a binary model, have been around for some time. And in fact, it's expert systems that have often been used to inform automated decision making by governments and institutions about people's rights and liabilities. And when we talk about AI, we often talk about the fact that it's opaque or that it's a black box. But I think it's worth remembering that actually expert systems are hand-coded. There's nothing they may be complex, but they're not actually particularly opaque. And the issue with expert systems and their work in institutions is more the imbalance of power and the lack of contestability, or the lack of a right to complain on behalf of the recipient of a decision, rather than the opacity of the technology, or indeed the lack of explanation. So, I think it's important to not get bogged down in the fact that AI is complex and technical. Sometimes it's just used in ways that acts against the interest of people, and sometimes it's used in very beneficial ways. And really, I think it's important to focus on the outputs rather than getting obsessed with the technology. That said, of course, new machine learning statistic algorithms have given us a new capacity to do all sorts of interesting things, find patterns in data. So this model shows what we can do with different kinds of algorithms. So on the left, we have a visualization of a data set. We can use on that data set a linear model regression, which is a statistical technique to draw a line through the data to identify sort of basic patterns in it, perhaps in this case, who's able to repay a loan and who isn't. But that really isn't particularly nuanced or accurate or precise. And one of the things that new machine learning models have given us, and the advantage really on either simple statistical methods or indeed the hand-coded expert systems that I was talking about earlier, is the ability to pick up much more sophisticated and fine-grained patterns in the data and use those to make predictions, which can in fact be very helpful in various fields. Ability to repay might be one possibility, but also in terms of diagnosing diseases, or indeed tracking people's education learning, or predicting environmental degradation or the effects of natural disasters. So those insights from machine learning algorithms are very important. And it's here that we get into problems of transparency. But again, I'd say that we shouldn't get bogged down in that question, because really what we should be looking at are questions of accuracy and fairness of how these are used. Neural networks have become more complex ways of sorting and understanding data again, and of course led to the ability with language that comes with generative AI, and most famously ChatGPT. Now, ChatGPT, as you all will know, is not sentient AI or general AI. It's a predictive model which has been trained on large amount of data drawn from the internet, and then is able to make predictions about the pattern of words in any particular phrasing. So, for example, if we have a phrase, "the woman ran up the something," at least in Australia, the answer is unlikely to be gazpacho, which is a food. It's more likely to be stairs or hill, which have higher probabilities. And in fact, in this case, the model has predicted the stairs is the most likely word to continue. And the beauty of ChatGPT is it can keep doing this predictive it can keep using this predictive technique to find the next word, but by reference to the original prompt. So it stays in context for quite some time. And that's what gives it its apparent fluency. But of course, again, it's just a predictive model. It works by statistics. And so it is often fluent, but it has no ground truth, which is why we get problems of so-called hallucinating or making up information, because ChatGPT isn't a truth machine, it's a language prediction machine. Nonetheless, it has taken the world by storm, and at least in Australia, people have been full of ideas of how ChatGPT might undermine the work that we do, or in fact, it assists the work we do as both academics, or in my case, a lawyer. And it's useful for all sorts of things, even with its limitations. So people suggest that really with an academic focus, ChatGPT or generative AI is useful for things like researching, summarising, writing first drafts, email management, as ChatGPT is increasingly going to be or ChatGPT-like products will be increasingly embedded in Office, things like Office 365 that we use to run our computers. search functions similarly, and in fact ChatGPT is apparently very good at coding. So most of my colleagues in computer science are, experimenting with how they assess students now that students can use ChatGPT to code better than a human would, which isn't necessarily the end of the world, because they are capable of, assessing their students' coding in other ways. And students who know the basics of coding will be better at giving the prompts to ChatGPT. But that is probably another conversation, which I won't pursue. I've sort of talked about the way then that ChatGPT may help some of us. And that's obviously, that list was biased to the type of work that I do, but help us with day-to-day tasks without profoundly changing what we do. Nonetheless, there's been a lot of social concerns about the impact of generative AI on individuals, society, and democratic institutions. So I thought I'd just mention those now. Now, that's Elon Musk, who's a tech billionaire and has quite strong views on things. Now, Elon Musk famously doesn't like AI, and he probably hasn't said AI is bad, but he said that he was one of the people that suggested that we should have a moratorium on generative AI. I think that's a little bit of a superficial view, but I think it's worth digging behind that concern about generative AI to see why people are worried about it. And generally, when we're thinking about the harms from AI, and that might be from generative AI or generally, we can sort of put together a stack, I think, of the kinds of harms that we might, as a society and as individuals, be worried about. And those start with technical risks. So things like the technology might be inaccurate. I've already spoken about the risk of ChatGPT hallucinating, but even when we're using machine learning models, they might be brittle or not robust. They might not work well with new data. They might not work well with outlier data, so they might be inaccurate. And of course, we're all concerned, or many of us are concerned, about the risk of bias, where the outputs of any AI are only as good as the data that it's trained on. So if the data is only representative of one demographic group, it's going to fit badly for another demographic group, and even produce worse outcomes for them. Now, to some extent, that those issues of bias and accuracy can be fixed. So people are training ChatGPT or GPT on more data to try and reduce the risks of bias. They're also refining the models to make them more accurate. So, for example, in my field, which is law, there's been quite a lot of work of refining GPT on legal materials so that it becomes more accurate. And you could imagine doing that for health or literature or engineering, just to make it more accurate for specialities and also more accurate for countries, because of course ChatGPT has predominantly been trained on US material and therefore may have a poor fit to other countries that may have different cultures and values. So that's the technical risks, things that can be adjusted by refining the technology. Then we have the social risks. That's really the risks, I think, to individuals. So the concern about most AI technology, and ChatGPT included, is that it erodes the privacy of individuals. And I only came in at the end of the last session, unfortunately, because it sounded really interesting. And I think it was talking about the Andahar card and biometric identification. And that is the concern of new technologies. The more information that is gathered about individuals, the less individuals have sort of a freedom to think and experiment and express themselves, and that must have some effect on free speech and the development of personality, values, and the like. So generally, we think privacy is important. It's to the development of the individual and them forming a view about their role in society and in relationships and in the state. And if people are constantly surveilled and surveilled in quite a fine-grained way, it's felt that those values are eroded. Societal risks are kind of the next level in the stack. And here we come into the problem that actually arises from the growing availability of generative AI, which is this idea of misinformation and deep fakes, which can be used not only to perpetuate scams, but also to potentially destabilize governments and societies. And I think it's worth dwelling on that for a while, because I think that is a really important concern when we think about the development of these technologies. So in Australia anyway, we've seen a lot of cryptocurrency scams, and these have been perpetuated through social media, but by using deepfake technology to put the faces of well-known and well-trusted celebrities into advertisements promoting cryptocurrencies, which of course are simply scams, simply asking people to invest in a scheme which will end up in having their money stolen. But why are people investing? Because they're beguiled into investing by the very realistic images that are presented to them that are fake images of their favorite celebrities. So that's this idea of deep fakes being used for scams or for sort of commercial purposes. But of course, that same technology can also be used for political purposes. So we've seen a lot of concerns about, deep fake pictures of various politicians, which has those politicians saying outrageous things, which are supposed to inflame tensions or encourage extremist views. And as the technology becomes more sophisticated, we become less able to rely on what we see as a way of understanding what's happening in the world, or what our politicians are doing, or what different demographic groups are doing, or even what other countries are doing. And we're seeing this increasingly in wars, where there's been a fair degree of misinformation and use of images to create misinformation. So I think this is of real concern. And when you combine the ability to create fake images with the ability to create fake voices, which is another application of the sort of generative AI technology, you can see that the concern about, individuals and societies being tricked or manipulated into political actions, I think, becomes a very real one, and one that we should genuinely be concerned about. And the final one of those risks I wanted to talk about was the existential risk, which is as technology becomes embedded more in our lives, and as we become more reliant on technologies that talk to us and look like us, then we are faced with existential risks of what it means to be human. So if I come to work and talk to my computer, which summarizes the day's news for me and answers my emails, and then I go home and talk to Alexa, who plays me music, and maybe I have a robot at home who has cleaned the floor and maybe even turned the oven on, and then I sit down and have a chat to my virtual assistant, replica or the like, you start to wonder whether we as humans lose the ability to understand and cherish what is special in human relationships. And I think too, that is a real concern. And as you shall see, not one the law can deal with. So now, if you'll stay with me, I'm going to talk a little bit about how law and ethics have responded to some of these risks, ranging from the technical risks, the social risks, the risk to individuals, through to societal and existential risks. So how do we think about regulating AI in response to some of these risks? Well, one response is to put reliance on ethical principles. And here you can see on the screen Australia's ethical principles, but of course the OECD and ASEAN and the US and various other groupings have, I believe the Quad, have articulated the values they think are important in terms of the development, design and deployment of AI. And you can see at the centre of that, it's human-centred values. So we want AI to produce outcomes that allow human, social and environmental flourishing or well-being. We don't want benevolent uses of AI, and to ensure that, we are also asking for things like fairness, privacy and security, reliability, accountability and transparency to built into the very technology to ensure that the AI that we use, whether it's an expert system or it's through to generative AI, the systems that we're asked to rely on in health, in education, in government, are in fact working in the best interests of humans and respectful of human-centered values. Now, ethical principles are, of course, these sorts of ethical principles are, of course, not legally binding. People choose whether to comply with them, and they've been criticised on that basis. People have said, oh, well, you know, they're just soft law, they don't mean anything. And in fact, people have talked about ethics washing on the part of tech companies, where they express a commitment to these principles, but then go off and engage in manipulative or fraudulent activities to manipulate humans against their best interests. I am of the school of thought that I think these principles are useful. I think they're useful as an aspiration, and I think they're useful a reminder of what we need to be able to stay in control of the new technologies that we're being faced with. But some people, you know, some people want more. And here we have moves to regulate AI. And this is being driven in particular out of the EU and to some extent China. So the two sort of first movers, Canada a little bit, but the two main first movers in terms of actually regulating AI technology instead of relying on existing law and ethical principles are the European Union and China. And they've taken different approaches. So China's gone with quite a specific approach. It's regulating AI literally industry by industry, where the EU has taken a sort of global approach and is regulating AI use or almost in one go with its AI Act. Now, the AI Act, at least for Australia, and I'd be interested to hear your views about its likely impact on India. For Australia, we trade a lot. We're a very small nation, and we actually don't have I don't think we have the degree of tech innovation that you would see in other countries, including India, actually. So for us, the AI Act might be quite impactful because we'll both be buying in the technology from Europe and also ourselves wanting to sell to Europe. So I think this act will have quite an effect on Australia, although we have no plans. Australia has no plans to adopt something quite as wide-ranging. The AI Act is sort of from a start to finish regulatory regime. It basically relies on three main categories of risk. It's a risk-based regime, but risk-based in the terms that the categories of risk are predefined, and then there's obligations that attach to applications of technology that are in those categories. So you have unacceptable risk systems, which interestingly include real-time biometric surveillance in public spaces. They're banned. High-risk AI systems, so that's systems that are making decisions about human access to rights and services, for example, consumer credit worthiness, recruiting systems, some biometric systems. And then you have a limited or minimal risk categories, which interestingly include chatbots, video games, and so on. I say interestingly because, in fact, what we know is that AI chatbots and video games have imparted quite a lot of harm on individuals and indeed on society. So it's interesting to see that they are placed in the low risk category under this system, which is perhaps an indication of why its breadth might be its failing, because it may prove a little bit rigid. Anyway. Most of the obligations attached to high-risk systems, and their obligations to be very transparent about the data sets, to verify the cleanliness of the data sets, that they're not dirty data, that they're representative and timely, to document the training systems, to be transparent about the algorithms used, and to have an ongoing assurance system over the performance of the AI system to make sure that it is performing as expected and not deviating from the intended parameters. And in that sense, that probably is state of the art for AI regulation, to have some sort of assurance system that monitors performance. That actually overcomes somewhat of the black box problem as well, because instead of trying to look into the AI and work out how it's working, which at least for neural networks or even some machine learning models is sort of a thankless task, the AI Act contemplates quite close monitoring of the outputs, which is at least a way to pick up some of the concerns that we might have about, data drift or bias or the like. But no legal system, even the AI Act or China's industry-specific act, is going to deal with those human questions that I mentioned under the category of existential risks. And I think it's really important to remember this. And as a lawyer, this would really be my catch cry, that if we're going to be thinking about the place or the role of AI in society, we need to understand the technology. We need to think about the role of ethics and law, but we also need to keep reflecting on the role that we want or that AI should have in our lives, and what it is about being human that we value. And this is where I think, the philosophical and ethical conversations become, of vital importance, because at the end of the day, we as societies decide where AI is deployed. Now, some of the concerns for us about AI that are not legal concerns and not technical concerns, as I said, are about what AI does to humans. And one of those concerns is that as we rely on things like ChatGPT that can write beautifully and find information for us and do all sorts of interesting things for us, what does it mean? What does it mean for how we think? And, one of the things that ChatGPT can do is produce quite fluent language or text. And one of the concerns as an academic, I guess I have, is I write as a way of expressing how I think. So if people don't need to write, if they can type in a prompt and get an answer, what does it do to our ability to think critically or think deeply about issues? Is there a risk of what's sometimes called cognitive decline? And the article you can see there, that's from The Conversation by Naomi Barron, just talks about this idea that if students aren't themselves writing, and that might be writing code or writing text, does that sort of undermine the educative journey that we take students on, at least in higher education, but certainly in schools as well? Is there something fundamental about writing or typing or coding that is eroded and fundamentally undermined by a tool that can do it for you, and probably do it for you possibly in a better way than you do it yourself? I think it's a really interesting question. I'm pretty optimistic. I think we can find other ways to challenge and inspire students, but I think that the growth in AI really puts the pressure on teachers and educators to think about the skills that are really important to impart in the education system, and how we maintain and nurture those skills in an age where everything's at people's fingertips. Now, when I talk about this, people always go to me, oh yes, but when typewriters and computers and TVs were invented, older people like me always worried about what would happen to the youth, and the youth were going to be worse off because of them. Because of the and in fact the youth have been fine. TV, radio, typewriters haven't eroded the cognitive capacity of humans. That's true. I tend to think that things like ChatGPT are a little bit different, because they're not just a way of interacting with the world or expressing oneself. They're actually doing it for you. You type in a prompt and the material's produced. I think they're on another level, but maybe that's just me turning into a old-fashioned doomsayer. So, but I think it's something to think about. The other thing I wanted to second sort of concern, this central concern I wanted to raise, was this point about human. Increasingly, we as a society, or at least in some countries, are giving people AI companions. We're dealing with loneliness through giving people an AI. And on the left, you can see Paro, the robot seal, which is used in some places for older people with dementia. It's sort of comforting because it sort of moves and squirms and behaves like a little animal. It has big eyes. So older people often respond to it. So it's supposed to give comfort to older people. And then on the right, you can see Replica, the AI companion, which is a very sexualized AI avatar that people can create as a friend and a companion for them. And both of these are ways of dealing with people being lonely or alone or lacking in human companionship. Now, we might say, well, if it makes people feel better, humans feel better, what's the problem? I guess the flip side of that is whether it's actually right to deal with people feeling alone not having humans in lives by giving them pretend humans, pretend animals, pretend companions. Does that really deal with the issue of loneliness and alienation for society, or is it just a kind of stopgap measure so that some people are surrounded by friends and families, and some people get a technological replacement? Again, I think there's no easy answers here, but the questions need to be considered seriously. And my third provocation about the existential risks of AI goes to the environment. Generative AI can do wonderful things for us. It's quite remarkable, miraculous in many ways, but it's also really tough on the environment. So on your left, you can see an article which makes the point, this is research from MIT in the US, that training, this is from a couple of years ago, training a single AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetime. So the act of producing ChatGPT, and we know that ChatGPT, when it came out, I think ChatGPT was trained on a GPT, a generative, whatever it is, transformer, was 3, and now we're up to, I think, 4.5. Every time we improve those models, we're emitting, using tons and tons of energy and emitting, eons of carbon. And that's a question of asking whether that's worthwhile as well. What is the gain for the pollution we're adding to the planet? On your right, you also see a headline about the amount of water that is used to train generative AI. Of course, the data centers that are used to produce these models get very hot because they're using so much energy, and they're generally cooled by pumping loads and loads of water through the data center to keep the processes cool. And again, in a world that's warming and which water is an increasingly precious resource, is this really is the training of more and more refined models really in the best interests of humanity and the planet? Now, I don't know the answers, but again, I think that it's important not to get bogged down merely by the technology or the law when we're thinking about the risks and challenges and opportunities from AI, but also think about what I've termed these existential questions about our relationship with the technology in terms of, the environment, humanness, and so on. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and that's all I need to say for now. So thank you for having me.